Hark! It's an 87th Precinct podcast. This is the only podcast in the world dedicated to Ed McBain's seminal series of police procedural novels, which began in 1956 with Cop Hater and ended in 2005 with Fiddlers. There were 55 books in the series, and today's episode looks at book number 54, our namesake, Hark. I'm accompanied on this trip through a world of returning baddies and anagrammatical nonsense by my good old pals Mr. Morgan Brown.
Hello.
Mr. Stephen Royston.
Hello.
And I'd like to say thank you for sticking with us as we round out the main series of this podcast. We're nearly there, nearly done. So don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Look up at Hark87 Podcast to keep in touch with us and keep track of how we'll celebrate the conclusion of all of this. But, we're going to get started with Hark, book 54, which feels very strange. We are on the cusp of completing the series, ticking it all off. And that's what it's all about, really, isn't it? Lists and order.
And then we start again.
Yeah.
We should have just reviewed them in a random order.
Oh, that was the crisis that would befall my mental health.
Just pick them out, so sometimes you have to do a second podcast about the same book you've already done. Take you years!
Oh, blind. It's already taken us years.
Well, take you even more years.
Well, there you go. Do you know what? Before we get started, I haven't asked this for a while. What are you reading at the moment, gentlemen? Morgan, what's on your reading pile, or have you just read?
I've just recently finished a book by Saskia Holling called Girlsville, the story of the Delmonas and the Headcoatees.
Oh, that sounds good.
Which is great. Yeah, just a bit of an oral history of the women of the Medway garage punk scene of the 1980s and 90s. Which I've been looking for a while. It seems to be, it only came out last year, but it seems to be sold out everywhere. But I found it in a shop in Glasgow and blasted through it in about a day because I was very excited.
Yeah, that sounds good.
And now I'm reading a collection of short stories by Samuel Delaney called Driftglass, which is also very good.
Fantastic. What you got on the go, Steve-O?
I have just finished a book called Ultras by Owen McNamee.
Is that ultras as in ultra fans of
No,
sport?
it's not. No, because I was explaining this to somebody. So it is about... He's the guy who wrote Blue Tango, which I might have mentioned before, actually. I don't know what he's quite like. You know those books by David Peace that are all named after the years that I've not read any of?
Yeah.
But in the same way that I've read his book about Brian Clough, they're like fictionalised versions of non-fiction.
Right, okay.
So this is all about the troubles in Northern Ireland and about shady characters that the British government sent over, principally Robert Nairac, who was like a guy who kind of infiltrated the IRA, but also kind of egged on like the loyalist paramilitaries and allegedly took part in the blowing up of that Irish band who were called the...
that's the big show band.
Yes. The Miami show band in the mid-70s.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah, so... and there's also these other characters brought in, like half of them you can find them. So they're all real people. And it's fiction, but it's not fiction, but it is fiction. So it's quite interesting, yeah.
No, right, excellent stuff.
What about you?
Well, I was just looking at my list here, and every other book on it is generally a McBain. I did read another part of The City recently, which is a McBain city-based cop story set in a precinct.
Yeah.
But bafflingly, I don't know why he didn't set it in the same city as the 87th Precinct.
I thought the exact same thing, but it's just in New York, isn't it?
Yeah, because it's set in Chinatown. Isola as a Chinatown. It has all the equivalent stuff. I don't know.
It would have taken almost no revision to do that as well.
I know, absolutely. It was fine as a standalone. It would have been very weird to have been perhaps inserting it as a side note into the 87th Precinct series, but it wasn't too bad. And other than that, I've been reading the novelisation of the Beatles movies, the Hard Day's Night and Help, which it's amazing to think that those films were novelised, but I've been doing that for research for our other podcast, The Big Beatles Sort Out, that I do with my brother.
John Burke, who does the Hard Day's Night one?
Yeah, Burke wrote the Hard Day's Night one, and a chap called Al Hine wrote the one for Help. They're always great, those novelisations, because they are literally, here's a copy of the shooting script, go and write a story.
It'd be great if the books existed and then the films were based on the book.
It would be weird. It would be weird. But yeah, it does mean you get scenes described that don't end up in the film, that they were never even shot or whatever. Because it's just the shooting script there, and none of the revisions that come from actors changing things on set or schedules changing.
So they would have still been written before the film was
filmed.
filmed.
I guess because they would need to be ready in time for
the marketing of it. Yeah.
Or they would be written whilst filming was taking place.
I think before, because they read exactly as the shooting scripts were. So I think it's basically just someone's told, here's the script, go off and write the novelisation of this, regardless of whether it bears any resemblance to the finished product at all.
There's a gazillions of those for like science fiction films, aren't there?
Yes, there definitely is.
Interesting.
Right. Anyway, there's some additional book chat for you this episode.
Indeed.
But we will get on to Hark eventually, once we've talked a little bit about 2004, the year in which it was published. And I'll give you a review of McBain's doings at the time.
His comings and goings.
Yes. Well, anyway, let's have a look at the year. I've not got much because, as I've been saying almost every episode for the last few episodes, God, it's depressing researching modern history.
Good job he's not been writing over the last few years, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean... anyway, 2004, the Prime Minister in the UK was Tony Blair. The President in America was George W. Bush. It was a re-election year as well, so he was re-elected. And here are the things I've chosen to illustrate 2004. The 4th of February, Mark Zuckerberg launches the Facebook.
The Facebook.
The Facebook.
The Facebook.
A bit like the Batman.
Yes, indeed. It's the other way around.
Yeah.
He's gone from the Facebook to Facebook. God, I wish I could quit those social media things, but it's very difficult. But yeah, that's when Zuckerberg, the big weirdo, started doing that stuff. That was when it was like an on-campus thing. It's more like Harvard or something like that, wasn't it?
It was one of the Ivy League places, wasn't it? Definitely.
You'd miss all the videos about cats doing silly things, wouldn't you?
Quite. Let's jump forward from that to, the end of July, in fact, and we have the trial of Saddam Hussein beginning.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Which I mention only really because, I mean, in terms of figures that dominated the 1990s and the early part of the 21st century, I'm afraid Saddam Hussein was one of the big names. So his going on trial and what subsequently happened is a big important thing. We have a Summer Olympics in 2004 in Athens. Nice of them to give it to Greece, isn't it? You know? And talking about technology, 19th of August is when Google goes onto the stock market. So Google had been around a bit. And I'll give you a little bit more on Google just because it's kind of relevant to the book we're talking about.
Some Googling going on.
Yeah, I did Google. It's turned an infinite loop of Googling. Yeah, 22nd of November, the Orange Revolution begins in Ukraine.
All right, yeah.
If you want, relevance to contemporary events, sadly. And rather, even more sadly, on a global scale, really, in terms of sort of things you can't really do anything about. 26th of December in 2004 was when it was the giant tsunami in the Indian Ocean.
Oh, yeah.
Which is such, for anyone who celebrates Christmas and then wakes up on Boxing Day as it is here, and you're generally in a good mood and it's a nice festive period, and you put the telly on and you have to see that over the other side of the world and the suffering. I just remember that very clearly and very, very horrible. Yes, anyway, let me do a little bit about Google before we move McBainwards. I'd say guess what the original name for Google was, but you wouldn't be guessing until the end of time unless you knew, in which case you wouldn't be guessing. So there you go. Originally it was going to be called Backrub.
Yeah, I can't see a problem with that. I'll just backrub that.
Yeah.
It
was. I mean, apparently that was something to do with how they accessed some back-end results or something. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
But it's very sort of tech bros sort of backrub. That's a bit creepy.
Yeah.
Luckily, they went with Google, changing it from the name of the big number, and it all being about the idea that it returns you all these search results. They incorporate the company in 1998, and then in 2004, as I mentioned, they start offering shares at $85 a share. I have no idea what Google's current share value is, and it would be very easy to look up, but I'm not going to. I'll give them the oxygen of publicity. But they bought YouTube in 2006, so they got control of many amusing cat videos.
Yeah.
But here's a good question for you. Do you know on what television programme the first recorded use of the word Google as a verb was made?
Tomorrow's World.
It's a good guess. It's completely wrong, but it's an American programme.
Sesame Street.
No, that's a very good guess, but it's still wrong. I can guarantee Morgan has seen it and would have witnessed this episode. Not at the time, probably.
Buffy the Vampire Slayer?
Yeah, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, yeah. So there was an episode in October of 2002 where they're trying to find out something about one of their classmates who they think's got precognition powers. And Willow says to Xander, have you Googled her yet? To which Xander says, Willow, she's 17. And then she says, it's a search engine. And that's the first televised recorded use of Google as a verb.
Amazing.
Yes, so there you go. Good old Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
It's a shame some of the other ones didn't carry on for a bit longer.
Yeah, good old Ask Jeeves.
Yeah.
Yes, because...
Have you Alta Vista'd him?
Yeah.
Yet.
Lycos, was that one?
Yeah. Lycos. They were I don't know. It was such a weird, different time. A time of CDs on the front of magazines or in newspapers that apparently hooked you up online and stuff like that.
Yeah. Got the Tiscali CD.
Oh, yes. Tiscali. Crazy. It's like yesterday, but a million years ago.
Yes.
Have you back rubbed her?
Have you?
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
Yeah. Right. Anyway, from McBain, obviously, we know from talking about his illnesses and things like that. I've not got much to say about his actual personal life and health at this point. He publishes Hark in 2004, and the other thing he publishes in 2004 is, or he doesn't publish per se, he writes Love or Money, which listeners to this podcast may have heard the mini episode I did about it, and if you haven't, go back and do your homework. Which he writes for the BBC short story competition called End of Story. So he writes a story with a cliffhanger in it, and then people were invited to submit. Some people went out and met him, and he chose the ultimate winner.
What, to resolve the story, you mean? Oh, right, I see.
But he did also write his own end to it. So there is a little mini 87th Precinct story that he wrote.
Oh, right,
so that's why I did that little separate podcast about it, you see. That's my reasoning. Yeah, and I will say I did sort of summarise in that episode some of the endings, the 6 endings, I think, was it? That there was 6 endings chosen by a panel. Then 3 of them went forward to McBain, and he chose the ultimate one. And the ultimate one was definitely the best of the 6, and some of them were like, these people have never read the books at all, I haven't got a clue about the competition doesn't require that you do. It's very strange to read something where it suddenly quite jarringly doesn't have the feel of it. Not necessarily the skill of McBain, because, he's a writer who's been writing a long, long time. These people don't necessarily, they weren't professionals. But yeah, some of them, it's very, very jarring anyway. So you can look that up still. It's still there on the web, archived on the BBC's pages. Okay, so let's get on to Hark. A name I chose for this podcast because I like the sort of announcy feel of it, having not read the book myself at the time. I mean, I could sort of retrofit the idea as well that this book's got quite a lot to do with looking up stuff on computers. So, this is a podcast which relies on computing technology. I can retrofit it like that, if you like. But yeah, let's ascertain. Steve-O, had you read it before?
I had indeed, yes.
And Morgan?
I didn't think I had, and then I started reading it and realised that I absolutely, totally had, yes.
Yeah, I think it's one that you would remember very quickly once the concept kicks in.
Yes, it came flooding back then, yeah.
Well, I will, as the most recent reader, I will try to summarise the main thing that goes on here, and that is that the deaf man is back.
He is.
And this time his weapon of choice is anagrams and quotations and some numbers for some reason.
And palindromes.
Palindromes getting there. Word games, number games. Essentially all the things you just wouldn't use if you were trying to do what he was actually trying to do. Which is a fundamental problem to his character and the story, I think. So he's teasing the 87th Precinct. He's back, having been left for dead in Mischief a few years before. Yeah, rather than just carry out his crime, as usual, he wants to wind up Steve Carella and the 87th Precinct. He's putting in a distraction technique so they don't know whether it is a Stradivarius violin that he's going to steal or a First Folio Shakespeare book that's currently in the library in the city. And we also have, peppered throughout this as well, lots of romance issues. I say romance not in the sense of this is not lots of people looking at each other with love hearts in their eyes, although there is at least one pairing.
Yeah, a little bit of that.
Yeah, there is one and a half pairings, let's say, because Ollie Weeks gets his moment with Patricia Gomez at the end. But mainly it's two couples essentially falling.
4 couples and 2 weddings. It's a bit like the film.
Yeah, the film 4 couples and 2 weddings. Yeah, there is a lot of there's quite a bit of family stuff because Carella's family.
1 wedding, 2.
It's one dual wedding, isn't it?
Yes,
so Carella's sister and mum get married. Yeah, there's all sorts going on in here, and then we like I say, we get Ollie Weeks coincidentally coming in to investigate the death of a pimp, which is related to the deaf man being there and someone he's using, which then sends him down a path where he discovers the person who stole his manuscript.
Oh, yes, I've forgotten about that.
Which we will get to, the plausibility of some of this stuff. And, yeah, it's a fairly chunky tome, I think. I mean, Steve-O, to spoiler here, has got a different edition to the one that Morgan and I have. The paperback runs to 352 pages, so it's a solid beast, really.
Yeah.
It doesn't look super massive in Steve-O's edition, but it's,
Tiny writing. No, for that size, that's slightly larger than usual, I think.
Yeah, they're not tiny books at this time, are they? But I think that's pretty typical of the market.
I think so, yeah.
Let's try and get into this then. I mean, I am going to come to Morgan first and just ask for sort of first impressions before we get stuck in. Or rather, your re-impressions.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember where in the order of the different Deaf Man books I actually read this originally. I mean, I do always enjoy his preposterous schemes, but I mean, they are preposterous, and this one is like fairly high up in terms of the sort of most preposterous, isn't it? Yeah, I think possibly when I originally read it, it might have been quite relatively early on in my 87th Precinct fandom, and I was just sort of devouring these books and just kind of dived through it and didn't really think too much about how ludicrous it was. And I think now coming back to it after we've sort of gone through the entire thing in order, you're sort of a bit more aware of how daft it is compared to some of the other things. I know with the Deaf Man ones, you sort of, it's a bit different to reading a normal entry in the series, isn't it?
Definitely.
You accept a certain amount of ludicrousness. Some of the throwbacks to earlier books I could definitely have done without, because
quite a lot in this, isn't there?
Yeah, some of them are fine. Then I think because the last Deaf Man entry was probably my least favourite book in the entire series, I wasn't too happy to see some throwbacks to that coming out. So I don't know.
Steve, do you reckon you could list the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Deaf Man books? Off the top of your head?
Absolutely, definitely not. 8 Black Horses.
The Heckler first,
yeah,
was it?
8 Black Horses.
Yeah, the Heckler is one of them. Heckler was 1960.
Fuzz,
1968.
Oh, you got much better memory than I have.
Then the sequel to Fuzz, the sequel, Let's Hear It for the Deaf Man, 1973. The only one with his name in it.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't even got that one.
8 Black Horses, 1985. Then Mischief, 1993, and now Hark in 2004.
Yeah, I can't get the impression he kind of, ultimately looking back on those, like how he wastes him as a bit of a character, I think, really. I don't know. Because like this, you don't, like you're saying, you don't mind the Deaf Man as novel entries as being a bit dafter, but they definitely used to be a bit dafter in like an amusing, almost like anti-hero kind of on, and yet this is daft. It just like, well, certainly for the first half, I thought really, really boring, because you just get all these messages come through, and you know full well you ain't going to be able to make any sense of them for ages, otherwise the whole device of the book is kind of blown. So I was just rereading this, just wading through page after page, and just like, this is, reading it, but just like, this is boring. This is, really boring. It's so obviously anagrams. It would take any person over the age of 10 about 1 second to realise that's probably what they were. And yet you have chapter after chapter of about 12 detectives retaking what they say literally, and I just found it stupid. But halfway through, when that device ends and they kind of latched on to what he's on about, it settles down then, and I found the back half a lot more interesting and engaging, and it then starts to rattle along with the caper, and the other stories gained a bit of momentum as well. But the first half I thought was not a great read, really.
No, I'm kind of with you on that one. I mean, the notes never really stop coming, but there is a point where the focus shifts.
Yeah.
And like you say, the caper kicks in, and you get the stuff that you like in a caper, like someone doing how do we replace a chauffeur to, get all that stuff.
I think that was kind of the strength of the earlier Deathman ones, particularly like, I guess there's at least a couple of them where he's got like a little crew, and you spend half the novel kind of following his machinations, don't you? And that's quite fun, I think. Whereas these ones, you just see the notes coming in, and then occasionally him displaying his tremendous legendary sexual magnetism, which is always a bit creepy and disturbing, and we don't really want to see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's what I mean about he wasted him as a character. Those early ones, I've probably mentioned it in those, like, always remind me a bit more like the Parker books, where he's got a bit of a squad, and one of them's bound to be a bit of a liability, and it's all going to go totally tits up at some stage, but you can't quite work out how or why. But this kind of lacks all that, really.
Yeah, because the only person he works with in this is the ex-prostitute that he hires to do all his running around.
Yeah, who he seems to just let her to handle it however she wants, which is unlike him, really, because he normally controls everything down to the last detail.
Yeah.
She's incredibly sloppy and gets the police after her.
He never really gets out of his dressing gown, does he, in this?
He just can't be asked, can he?
Yeah, you see, all that device, so, all these messages he's sending, he picks up this girl, doesn't he, and then he gets her to find means of getting the messages to the precinct station, which she ultimately does by, first of all, getting prostitutes to deliver them, but then that all goes awry, so then she gets like drug addicts after
Seems
that.
like a very expensive and risky way of getting some messages delivered.
I cannot believe that. I don't know how many messages are in this. Must be 50 plus. They would all be. It's just so uncredible. Uncredible, boring notes take up about a third of this book, and it's just
I think one of the other problems is, it strikes me, and I think what's telling is there's an acknowledgements page at the back of this book where he acknowledges Daniel Starrer as his researcher who's been with him for quite a while, and clearly he was going to have to do a lot of work, because he said to him, I need quotations from Shakespeare, I need this, I need to know how a computer works, all that sort of stuff, and clearly this guy's had lots to do, but he's devised this concept of anagrams, he's devised this concept of using Shakespeare quotes, and then there's clearly not enough Shakespeare quotes to meet his needs, so he's had to just start making things up, which then translates into the actions of the deaf man as a character. And so it doesn't make any sense. The whole scheme just falls apart. Yeah,
it's all over the place, isn't it? It's not one coherent scheme at all. It's just it's a bit of a shambles. I mean, I slightly prefer it to the one in Mischief, which was I thought was very poor work from the deaf man, didn't it involve some kind of made up science fiction novel for some reason, and then an announcement that he somehow knew was going to spontaneously cause a race riot, which obviously wouldn't have happened in real life. It was just absolute garbage, but this one's not far behind.
Yeah, it's also got some of that element of 8 Black Horses, where he's got a consistent thing where he's sending pictures.
8 Black Horses, that's what you want a bit more. It's like,
Well, and the police can be excused for not knowing what on earth they are, but in this, it's like there's no excuse for not like clearly noticing that the line has the same letters, exact same number and same letters. Yeah. It's also, I'd not thought about it before with the Googling, so he's obviously trying to like stick in like the modern, the contemporary times, isn't he, with that, and obviously Corelli using that to try and solve it. But then at the same time, the deaf man's using like a real 19th century writing to the police kind of messages handed to the desk.
Yeah, it's like never occurred to him that he could save thousands of dollars by just sending him an email instead.
Yeah, so it's just it's all a bit
I think
mad.
I also struggle in terms of, I found the chapter where he explains to his assistant, the deaf man explains to his assistant what an anagram is. And it's so embarrassing and like, do you really think your readers don't know what an anagram is? And he's using it as a bit of, it doesn't work for me in terms of the deaf man as a character. It's one thing for him to do the deaf man explaining in detail how the odds of something work, because it shows him then as a real genius.
Yeah.
But everyone knows what an anagram is.
Yeah, I mean, I can believe that to some extent the deaf man is also a condescending prick,
Oh,
which
yes.
is how he comes across. But he obviously doesn't need to explain that, and to suggest that there's a character who doesn't know what an anagram is just seems ludicrous.
Yeah. Right, well, let me do a little bit of through the story, through some of the beats in the story. I mean, the first chapter is a direct follow-on from Mischief. I mean, not time-wise, it's a follow-up to Mischief, because he's tracked down the woman who shot him and left him for dead in that book.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
He's been off to find his special doctor who fixes him up, and he comes back to find this woman who, for some reason, has stayed in the city, or has come back to the city where...
As you do, yeah.
Making herself easily traceable. Yeah, and he finds her, steals a safety deposit box, and kills her. And I mean, that gives us a body for the police to chase anyway. And we get Monaghan and Monroe turning up at that crime scene, and we learn that Monaghan has been married at least twice, which is to the shock of Monroe, who doesn't even know that he's married now.
They've been partners for
however long.
Yeah.
We get establishing scenes with Kling and Sharon Cook. We get Cotton, who is now seeing Honey Blair, the news reporter. That's the one thing I didn't mention.
Oh, yeah.
The other thread in this is someone taking pot shots at Cotton Hawes, and how he investigates that affects his relationship.
That was another really strange thing about this book, in that, like, none of the other detectives seem to really give too much of a shit about that story.
No.
Is it?
True. That's just true.
You know, and yet in previous books where, like, one of the detectives has been shot at,
the whole
police
the
force
squad rallies round, don't they?
Yeah. In this, they don't even talk about it, let alone investigate it. It's
just
really...
turns out no one likes Cotton, so they're all secretly happy that someone's taking
It's
a
just
pot shot at
really...
him.
Yeah, that's another really odd aspect to the whole thing as well. Anyway.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, it does give Richard Gennaro the chance to talk to Cotton Hawes and say, "Oh, I was shot in the foot once," which is a throwback to Fuzz, one of many throwbacks in this one. What I was going to do was actually, I'm sure we touched on this before for some reason. The anthrax mailings in the US are mentioned, and that kicked off. You were working in a post room at the time, weren't you, Morgan?
Yeah.
I'm sure I talked about this perhaps when it came up in some of the history sections we were doing. But it did change how you handled post and stuff, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we certainly, all the latex gloves and various other bits and bobs that we had to do, and more sort of checks on everything.
And so that's why, as you know, there's the curiosity of someone delivering stuff by hand is, mentioned in a bit more detail. Anyway, notes keep arriving. Essentially, my notes are notes keep arriving.
They certainly do.
Yeah.
That's mainly what happens.
Yeah.
There are some notes.
Yeah.
And they start with anagrams, then they start with read them both the same way around, and then they go on to Shakespeare, don't they? That's generally the pattern they follow.
Yeah, I got so lost in the...
Apart from when Parker sends a pretend one to Richard Gennaro that reads "Hello, asshole" upside down. That was the best note, I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a section of this where Eileen Burke's asked to go and cast a woman's eye over the crime scene.
Oh, yeah.
And she makes a reference to a Disney film where they hired a teenage girl to look over the script. But it turned out this girl was a 30-year-old woman, and I couldn't find out what that was.
That does feel like it must be a real thing, but I don't know.
So it's a Disney film that was written before 2004. So where they sort of got a teenage girl in to check over a script. So I don't know what that would have been. I just couldn't find that. So if anyone knows, I would be interested.
And then Eileen goes to the safe deposit place where Melissa's just taken all the cash. And never once do they consult CCTV. They could have found out who it was at that point.
Yeah,
I mean, it's as though he's kind of lost his bearings on how crimes would be solved, really. Because they could have, just got the CCTV of the bank.
Yeah,
there she is. Well, find that person.
Very true. Yeah.
I know he always says that the squad start acting like idiots when the deaf man's involved, but they really do, don't they?
They do. Yeah.
Then we've got Kling discovering that his wife is mentioning by name another man by first name, and this just makes you want to push Kling out of a building. He just instantly starts being suspicious of his wife talking to a fellow black doctor, and it's kind of the thread of black and white relations that runs through a lot of these stories, played out through making Kling into an absolute dickhead.
Yeah, that's all really heavy-handed, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. Because they then talk about. It's like they talk about the band Spitshine.
Oh God!
Which means we get the song from Mischief again.
That's what that was the throwback that I really didn't want. Oh God!
Yeah. Anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to be reminded about stuff like that, do you?
No.
Corella, who is presumably using an abacus at work, goes home with a bunch of Shakespeare books he's got from the library, and his kid says, "Oh, why don't you just use Google?" This is something I find very... Because surely even by 2004, search engines must have been one of the key instant tools you could use for looking stuff up, referring for... it's not like that was something the police went, "Oh, no, we don't need Google. We've got magnifying glasses."
I think you'll find it wasn't actually until 2005 that a 12-year-old told the New York Police Department to start using Google.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these things are just... It has reached the point, really, where he kind of think his years are a bit more obvious, aren't there, in a lot of his writing, which is understandable, really.
It is.
But
he's incorporated new technology better in older books as it's come along, as it's been more, but it's tended to be stuff that's more specifically police technology rather than general technology.
Yeah, but this. I imagine a 40-year-old detective would be aware of Google. I think we can reasonably assume
in 2004,
or at least other search engines.
Yeah,
some kind of search engine he would have been aware of.
Yeah. But I will say, I did check out to see whether the website that his son Mark, Corella's son Mark, shows him, Rhyme Zone Shakespeare Search, whether it was a real thing and whether it still exists. It is real and it does still exist.
Wow.
And so I could replicate exactly what they did by typing Darling Buds into Rhyme Zone Shakespeare Search, and it returns it exactly. It hasn't changed in all that time, and there's very few websites that haven't changed in the stretch of time we're talking about.
I'm choosing to believe it looks exactly like a website from 2008.
It does, yeah.
Has it got a little counter?
Well, I didn't see a counter at the bottom, but I will show you a quick...
just as a number 3 now.
Now I've visited...
After Ed McBain, David What's-His-Face, and now you...
Daniel Starer and then me.
Starer, yeah.
Let me see if I'll show you guys the picture while I'm here. I did put it on our Twitter feed, and it looks essentially like that's the top of the page.
That's brilliant.
So it's just like that in the centre of the top of the page.
Excellent. Rhymes. Well, there you go.
But it works. It does what it says in the book.
So somebody created that like 20 years ago and just sat there ever since.
And I've insane, really. Yeah, so someone attempts to shoot Cotton again. There's some weird little scenes where Steve and Teddy meet a caterer for this upcoming wedding. The fact that Yeah, the timescale in this doesn't work actually as well, because he's still trying to get a caterer for the wedding. Literally, I think a week before the wedding's happening, which seems a bit close to call.
Clearly written by a man who's never planned a wedding.
Had several, never planned one.
Yeah.
We also do get the coupling up of Hal Willis and Eileen Burke. They get partnered together, and the sort of jokey love they had for the situation they were putting in Fuzz finally comes to fruition in this, which I think is nice, because Hal Willis hasn't had much to do in this at all, really, and his only real romantic story ended in absolute tragedy.
Yes.
So
Yeah, he's always been a good character.
Yeah,
didn't he?
I like.
He had a fair run of prominence in like some of those like late 70s, early 80s books, didn't he? But
Yeah,
perhaps underused as a character. I don't know.
good for those two anyway. Hope it works out for him.
yes, well, we'll see in the remaining
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, maybe we don't. I don't know.
Well,
Maybe it's not long enough for it to go tits up.
notes keep arriving. I say again, there's a reference to the birds.
Of course there is.
Yeah, someone says that movie that Hitchcock wrote. And then we have an appearance of Captain Frick for the first time since 1992.
Yeah, he's good. He's good value, Captain Frick, isn't he?
Yeah, he actually, does something in this. He has a couple of pages where he's doing something. And the deaf man's assistant, Melissa, goes out and buys a gun. So this is something the deaf man hasn't figured out, is that if he gives someone a load of money, she might not necessarily spend it on exactly what he wants her to spend it on. Yeah, she ends up killing her former pimp, which brings Ollie Weeks into the whole thing. And we get to learn that there's a Greek musician playing a Stradivarius appearing in the city. We get to learn that there's a Folger first edition of Shakespeare in the city. Again, that all checks out. The Folger Shakespeare Library does exist. There are something like 82 copies of the first folio in their collection, and you can, talking about websites, if you want to, you can go online and see a digital version of it. It's a lot easier to do the research for this book now than it would have been in 2004. Yeah, and then, I mean, again, Ollie just is a brilliant cop in this.
Yeah.
And in fact, a better cop than he's ever been, because he doesn't succumb to as much temptation. He's not as rude. He's not as horrible.
He occasionally finds himself checking his own racism a little bit.
Yeah.
Occasionally.
Yeah, he's just relentless, isn't he? When he's on like
however dodgy some of these books get, the scenes where Ollie's just doing the legwork are always a joy, aren't they?
Yeah.
So some of the best scenes in this are with him, especially, jumping ahead maybe, but
we'll get there.
Yeah.
So the caper part of it, where the deaf man hires a limo and he sort of talks to the driver to work out where they got the uniform from, and the driver turns out to be from the UK, from England, and again, you see, he does all this research. So he tasks Daniel Starr to go and do all this research, and then he has a character and he says, whereabouts in England are you from? And he says, I'm from London. I'm from a place called Cheapside. Do you know it? Cheapside's not a residential area.
No,
it's just by St Paul's.
Yeah, you'd just say, I'm a Cockney, wouldn't you?
Yeah, no one lives in Cheapside. I got bombed in the Blitz. There's not been any houses there for, as far as I'm aware.
Not unless you're
it's a street as well.
A Russian billionaire, I suspect.
Well, you might have a...
Yeah, but no, you're right. Nobody would ever
say, I'm from a little area called Cheapside.
Yeah, no, they wouldn't.
You'd say, I live near St Paul's, if you live near St Paul's, or something like that. I don't know, it's just...
Yeah, he's always done that.
He's not very good at his London stuff.
No.
Anyway.
It's almost he knows too much about it, and therefore you get too detailed.
Yeah, somewhere between too much and not enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too much is...
Simultaneously.
Yeah.
But we do get Ollie coming across, by chance, a sex worker, prostitute called Emma, who he turns out to be Emilio, who was the person that stole his book.
Hey.
In a brilliant bit of coincidence.
The scene where he takes him back to the station house, and he's that's like a really good bit, isn't he? Because you stole my book. You didn't write it. Yes, I did.
There's a bit where he describes Ollie as Ollie darts out of his chair and he's coming around the desk with his hands outstretched. You can almost see that like a cartoon.
Yeah, you can. Yeah. You can.
Why you?
I'm her. You can't be. I've met her. What do you mean you've met her?
Yeah, I think that was funny.
And he was like, why? He was like, oh, don't worry, I can remember it all. He was like, I mean, does it end with like, oh, this is going to be the beginning of a brilliant relationship or something, and then he records him reciting it, doesn't he, word for word?
Yeah. So
because he says he burnt it. I want it back. You can't have burnt it.
It's just, I mean,
why did you burn it?
It's a very funny sequence. I mean, it does make you have to believe that this drug addict sex worker remembers word for word something from, you know, a couple of years ago, probably in the timeline of this. I'm not sure where the timeline goes. It's very hard to follow with that. But, you know,
I guess they got so involved in it, they've like read it countless times. It's as novels go, it's a chapter.
Yes, exactly.
So.
It does say that as well in here, doesn't it?
And then the scene after that, all the other detectives are crowded around saying, oh, that's amazing. It's like, did you really write that?
Yeah, it's bonkers. It's bonkers. One thing I really do like about this, talking about men from the United Kingdom, is that it turns out at the special event at the library to do with the Shakespeare book, Patrick Stewart's turning up to do a reading. I love the idea that the world of Star Trek The Next Generation has crossed over. Well, the world of the human man, Patrick Stewart.
It can be the only entry in which somebody from Huddersfield's in one of these books, anyway.
That's very true. That's
where's from Murfield, near enough.
Yeah, get it right. We don't want to get letters from Murfield gang. But yeah, I like the idea that it's just dropped in that Patrick Stewart's going to be there. Yeah, and yeah, what else do we get? Kling's still following his partner and this other guy and a third person, a white woman that they seem to be meeting up with. Hawes does manage to track down the shooter, not realising that he'd sent a note to Honey Blair to say, I wasn't trying to kill you. So,
which he withheld.
Yeah.
In order to keep the story big on the news. And
it's not good.
Not good.
But we also get another point where Carella's with his son looking up stuff on Google at home, and the word grot is used. And I'm going to have to get the page up on this. It's page 297 in the paperback.
Yeah, that's...
It says, nice grot, stop. What's a grot? Carella asked. British slang, Mark said. Brit kid in my class says that all the time. I feel a bit grot today. What? Now,
yeah.
I appreciate we weren't kids... 13-year-old kids, which is how old Mark Carella's supposed to be at this point.
Maybe all the 13-year-olds were saying this in 2004. I don't think so.
What I do like about this, though, is the word grot is clearly a shortened form of grotty, grotty being a shortened form of grotesque. The first time the word grotty is used is in the Beatles film, A Hard Day's Night. First time that was ever used the first time it was recorded on anything.
Amazing.
So, but no one I know has ever said, I feel a bit grot today.
No, I think even by the time we were 13-year-olds, grotty would have sounded a bit odd and sort of dated, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Unless you were referring to Grotbags the Witch.
Yes, and that's a whole other story.
Yeah, Grotbag, yeah.
So again, sorry. I think this is what you get with this podcast, a uniquely British perspective of people getting annoyed about things.
That's all we can offer, though, really, isn't it?
That's all we've got. Yeah. So anyway, we roll in towards the end. Essentially, Kling confronts Sharon. Turns out to be entirely innocent, and he's basically put his relationship on the rocks. The caper finally takes place. It turns out it's the violin that the deaf man's after. What he's foolishly done, though, is leave his computer available to be hacked. Well, cracked is the word they use. I mean, she basically just logs on and
switches it on.
And just looks at his stupid records and finds that he's only booked escape tickets for himself.
Yeah, it's kind of like the episode of The Simpsons where Lyle Langley, who's built the monorail, has left in his office a cartoon of himself escaping with bags of money while the monorail falls to pieces. Sort of like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And everything's just neatly laid out in helpfully labelled folders, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, he's become a very sloppy criminal genius by this stage, hasn't he? But
again, we've had a story not long ago where it was a computer with really neatly labelled files, although it had anagram names on it. But it was the suggestion that computers... It's not really how computers work. He's sort of doing a bit like you would expect in a Columbo thing from 1983, where it's like that would be the technology MacGuffin. Anyway. But yeah, the deaf man, being apparently the idiot that he is now, gets shot by this woman. So that's 2 stories that appeared, 2 stories where women have shot him.
Yeah, that legendary sexual magnetism that he used to control people is just not working out for him at all these days, is it?
He cuts it's fine, though, because he rings the squad room, doesn't he, on his actual phone?
Yes.
But then Scarpa's in just enough time not to be there when they arrive, so he can't be that far off, can he?
Yeah.
A trail of blood.
Yeah.
Yeah, very
Into a
true.
wardrobe.
Just standing there in his dressing gown, which he still hasn't changed out of.
Yeah. And then, that's essentially it. We find out what the crime was. It goes wrong for the deaf man as usual. Cotton confronts Honey Blair. They sort of break up. Kling and Sharon on a knife edge. Hal and Eileen are... They're all right. They're setting out together.
Having a lovely time.
And then Ollie goes and has a meal with Patricia Gomez, who sort of persuades him that he should perhaps go to the gym and drink milk and eat less. And he sort of agrees.
Yeah, she manages to actually say that without massively offending him, which is real progress.
A huge leap forward for the character, really. Yeah. It's nice. It's been the most rewarding thing, the rehabilitation of Ollie Weeks has been the most rewarding thing out of all of these books recently. And then, Melissa gets away with the violin.
She does.
There you go.
Indeed.
And that is that. I've not missed out anything really important, have I?
No, I don't think so, no.
Right, okay. Well, we'll get to some summing up, really, and then give our responses. In fact, and I shall hold a couple of contemporary reviews there ready to reveal afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to go to Steve-O for a quick summing up and score.
Well, I feel I did my summing up to start with, really, so I won't,
don't linger.
I won't repeat my rage, but yes, it gets better as it goes on, but too much of this book is spent with the mechanics of sending stupid messages. That said, there are some nice parts, especially with Ollie and when the caper gets going and the proper investigation to it. That's better. Everyone curiously couldn't care less that Cotton Hawes was shot at, which is a very really weird kind of aspect to this book. So you wanted a score, I suppose?
I am, yeah.
Oh, I think I'll go 55. It's a
55.
5.5 out of 10, I think.
Yeah.
Somewhere around there, anyway.
Right, Morgan Brown.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really argue with any of that. It is pretty daft. Although, I mean, I enjoyed it anyway. I like a daft scheme, although it's a bit too daft to sort of keep you hooked, isn't it?
You could just feel he could do more with him.
Yeah, or just pick one zany plan and actually really do it properly, rather than picking 3 and sort of doing them all in a really half-assed way. Yeah. So yeah, it's got its problems, but I feel a bit like I'm being disloyal if I go quite as low as 55. So I'm going to say 60 police shields.
Oh, blimey. Well,
yeah, 6. Well, yeah, it's of that ilk, I would say.
Although I should have knocked some points off for the return of Spitshine.
Yeah.
But
minus 20.
I'll stay there.
Caveat. Yeah. Well, I was the only person for whom this was a first-time read, and as a result, I had that thing of like, oh well, here's the mechanism. This is quite interesting. Let's see how that goes on. And then exactly as Steve-O says, it's like you're 4 chapters on from that point, and you're going, oh, it's still happening. So I will say my immediate feeling after the first full read-through was I didn't particularly enjoy it. I'm going to be honest. Going through it again for me notes today, as usual, I spot the character moments. I spot the nice things in it as well. But there is just too much going on. It does not need everything in it that's in it at all. I mean, I get that perhaps in his old age he's quite, wistful and looking back with these characters, hence so many references back to various things. But I don't know, it just feels a bit...
Quite a lot of the recent entries haven't had any of that. I seem to... And yet he's got it in spades in this one, really, hasn't he?
Yeah, well, I suppose the Deaf Man is a legacy character, isn't he? You know, he throws the... He gives him the opportunity to talk about his history, and his history more or less covers the entire history of the series, bar the first few novels. Yeah.
Well, those bits aren't that bad. It's like the main...
Yeah. The problem is making you think back to earlier Deaf Man novels makes you realise that the Deaf Man's just got a bit rubbish right now.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, he used to be good, didn't he?
Yeah. So I will be the baddie in this one, and because I'm only going 5 out of 10, as in 50 police shields.
Oof.
What does that give us?
I think we can work that out.
Oh yeah, of course we can. Sorry, I don't do maths like you do. You see, you're good at it. That's 55 police shields for Hark. So I kind of wish I hadn't named the podcast after one of our lowest scorers. But, I still quite like the sort of exclamatory, is that the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, or declamatory.
Nature of the word Hark. Anyway, it's a good word. Let me do a quick scan of some of the contemporary reviews. What have we got here? I have got the New York Times review from the 22nd of August 2004, which, of course, is now not loading on my electronic device.
Oof.
So I need to go.
Google it.
Yeah, I need to get a man to go to a library and dig out that copy of the.
Yeah, or find a 13-year-old child. They'll probably sort it out for you.
Right, here we go. So, Crime by Marilyn Stacio. In anxious times, she says, trust Ed McBain to send in the Deaf Man. Ever since he first appeared in Heckler, this fiendish criminal has been the scourge of Steve Carella and his fellow detectives in McBain's 87th Precinct crime novels. How fiendish is fiendish? In Mischief, the Deaf Man tried to set off a race riot in a city. In 8 Black Horses, which found the big bad city in the middle of a crime wave, his diabolical plan was to blow up the Precinct station house. There's a lot of stuff here. This is a long review.
Full history of the Deaf Man.
Yeah, a few of the personal dramas, so she sort of singles out some of that stuff. A few of the personal dramas stand out from the rest. Carella's inability to celebrate the double wedding of his mother and sister while he is still grieving for his father has psychological complexity. It does. It gives Carella the best, character parts in that sense.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Didn't really touch on that, but that's, yeah.
He says, but even the more conventional romantic scenarios carry the message that love is the best way to counter social chaos. I don't know that it does. I think the social issue that he keeps talking about is black people and white people. And in this one, he's talking about it falling apart in a loving setting.
Yeah, very true.
Anyway, she concludes by saying, if love can't conquer all, it's nice to know that an angry woman can make a monkey out of a terrorist.
Well, that's a good takeaway.
Yeah, I know. Although I did read that and my brain briefly did just think, monkey? Doesn't turn into a monkey.
An angry monkey can make a woman out of a terrorist.
Yeah, I've got the Washington Post review as well. There's lots of superlatives about the author in all of these things. McBain is playing for laughs, and he gets them, working skillfully to create just enough intrigue to keep us interested in the bad jokes, the puzzling riddles, and the domestic melodramas. The whole performance is deft and light. I don't feel it was light. It felt quite leaden to me. Like a magician's sleight of hand, the trick is pulled off while you look the other way. It's not that clever. I just don't think it's that clever. No. There's no sort of like, I hadn't realised that.
Like when you've seen him actually have that lightness of touch and that sort of deftness that he has in a lot of the other books actually in the series, you kind of realise that this is, it's a bit clunky, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
It is, sadly. But anyway, there we go. There's just a couple of reviews from the period. I couldn't find masses of them. But I think there's a certain time in an author's life when he's been as long writing and as well established as McBain that the reviews all start to blend into sort of the same stuff every time. And he'd had to have done something completely bonkers to get any different sort of review.
Yeah, well, his worst entries get better. If you think some of his amazing early ones used to get totally slagged off, didn't they?
Yeah. Well, certainly his star rises with the rise of sort of people's love of crime fiction as it becomes more respected.
Yes, yeah. Definitely.
Anyway, that's book number 54 done. I mean, we'll be back with a bonus episode to look at the book covers and other jazz from the year 2004. But when we come back, it will be for book number 55, which, if you don't know by now from the introduction to these programmes, is called Fiddlers. And
another violin.
yeah, violins all round. Violins all round? What am I talking about? Anyway, we'll be back for that and the bonus episode. So until then, I'll say ta-ra. Steve-O will say
goodbye.
And Morgan will say
Fairly well.